Everyone, this is lecture 13.1, repairing structures. So in this one, we're going to talk about how we could possibly create good jobs and look at some options there. And we're also going to talk about what universal basic income actually would be, and what are some other things that are socially, physically possible, even if in our society they're largely discounted. So, over the past 40 years, the United States has done a really good job of actually creating new jobs. This is something that we've done well at. However, those jobs that have been created have been very low paying and haven't generally come with benefits, especially healthcare benefits. And it should absolutely be pointed out that our European counterparts are generally paid more and have greater benefits than their American counterparts. And then to go with that, so they have better pay and benefits, but then also their poverty rates are much lower too. How it should be stated though that European nations have much higher unemployment rates than the United States, and thus they have to take care of more people, basically, which is where universal basic income comes in later on. The whole gist of this slide being that it's different other places, and it's not necessarily as bad as it is other places. In the meantime, CEOs continue to earn anywhere from 300 to 400 times as the average worker. That's not the lowest paid worker, that is the average person working in the company. Now, it should be pointed out that it appears that this all-time high was in the early 2000s, and then over the course of this century, it has kind of gone progressively down. With that said, this chart does not include the pandemic up until the present day, and we do know that certain corporations, places like Amazon, for example, actually benefited tremendously from the pandemic. So I would be interested looking at this data to see what is the average CEO's pay versus the CEO pay of those corporations that made loads off profiteering from the pandemic. One thing we could do to try to fix this would be to raise the minimum wage to a level that would support a family above the poverty line. And then we could index that minimum wage as inflation occurs. What does that mean? Well, when we put the minimum wage into effect in 1968, we set it, but we did not put in a mechanic to have it raise while inflation raised, right? So if we would have done nothing since 1968, then the current minimum wage would still be $1.60 per hour. If there would have been a mechanic to rise that, for example, that would have raised the minimum wage to about $13 an hour to set with the 1968 rate, right? But we did not do that. As a result, we have had to have these political fights, these political arguments about the minimum wage approximately every 10 years or so. And that has been tremendously difficult and harmful to the people making that amount of money making that minimum wage. Other things to add in here, it should be noted that since I originally put these slides together, there has been a tendency for companies to start paying $15 per hour. That has not been, in most places, forced by legislation, especially not federal legislation. There have been some locations in state and local governments that those places have raised the minimum wage to $15 per hour. Many companies, large companies, have started to offer closer to $15 an hour, recognizing this, but those efforts were done maybe not necessarily to help poor people, but to be more competitive because of worker shortages. But this is something we could do, being along these lines in terms of helping people in poverty. Raising the minimum wage is always something, and it's something we talk about in our society. Well, what would it do? How would it help? First of all, to go with it, it establishes the floor with which no full-time worker would fall below, hypothetically, right? There's a big problem with the minimum wage and current work cultures in that if you had a 40-hour-a-week job making $15 an hour, you could live maybe not a middle class lifestyle, but a working class lifestyle. You could be okay, right? Unfortunately, most almost all minimum wage jobs are part-time, right? So you would have to, as we've discussed already, string multiple jobs together to actually make a living. If we could make these full-time, though, it could allow workers to support a family of 3 above the poverty line, which was kind of the ideal and was quite common in the United States in the mid-20th century. Additionally, it would reinforce that idea that Americans attach to work, i.e., if you work hard, you can survive, right? Or maybe you can be successful. Additionally, it would somewhat address inequalities between CEOs who earn 300 to 400 times their average worker. Namely, if corporations were required to abide by this reasonable minimum wage, then they would have less millions of dollars to give to their CEOs, and things would be a tiny bit fairer. Now, it is the most common of arguments against the minimum wage that if we raise the minimum wage, then bosses would have to fire workers. And this is, I mean, from a economics, mathematics standpoint, understanding how capitalism works in its most simplistic form, that almost makes sense. However, as we have looked over the last 20 years, we have seen scientifically, empirically, that it just doesn't happen, right? It simply doesn't happen. Maybe there might be a couple places that have to lay off, but it is not the overall trend. And the overall trend would be to give more people better wages so they can live a better life. Absolutely, on the macro level, raising the minimum wage only helps society. And then another thing we can try to do that is a little bit more complex than raising the minimum wage is to expand the earned income tax credit. And unless you have been doing your taxes for quite some time, you have no idea what this means. Basically, the EITC is a refundable tax credit for low-income workers. And this is included in your IRS refund check if you get one. We could expand it to deliver economic relief at the low end of the earnings distribution and help furnish a strong work incentive. As it exists, the EITC today, in general, only helps middle-class families, right? So we have this earned income tax credit that helps middle-class families be more stable, but yet we are not giving that same money to working class and poor families. And that seems very counterintuitive when you actually look at it. If, for example, there were some kind of political difficulty with doing that across the board, then one area that you could negotiate over is that, okay, you won't let us give the earned income tax credit to all working and poor people. How about we just do it for the families with children? How about we just do that? And politically, that would maybe be a little bit easier for some opponents of these kinds of things to swallow. If we would extend this tax credit, we could supplement workers' wages so that the total income for the year would lift above the poverty line. That's what would happen, basically, if we would effectively just give people more money during tax season, if you will. Now, so many times when we're talking about helping poor people, we talk about paying taxes and the tax system and the IRS. That is, it's a weird idiosyncratic bit about the United States government and about how we have passed legislation over the last couple decades, is that our tax system is kind of set up to do this in a weird, highly bureaucratic way. It's set up to basically give people money, and then politically, when we give people money back through the tax system, for some reason, people don't see that as a handout the way they see things like food stamps or heating assistance as a handout, even though people use those money for heating and food assistance. It's just weird. The way we do taxes is weird. But let's look at it from the positive side, I guess. Everyone does pay taxes, but less educated people may be less likely to take advantage of more complex problems or hire people to do their taxes. What does that mean? That means that by one of the difficulties of the system as it exists is that, and what continues to make it a middle class oriented thing, is that working class and poor people aren't as good, basically, at getting that money back from the IRS as middle class people are, and that's a disparity in education levels as well. So the short of this slide, basically the way we give people money in this country is through the IRS, and if we could continue to do that hypothetically, but we definitely would have to do a little bit of work to make the IRS a little bit more accessible for middle class and working class people and poor people. Now, in 2018, 28 million Americans benefited from EITC and child tax credits. This pulled 10.6 million people above the poverty line who would have fallen below poverty. So as it exists today, the EITC has been effective in terms of helping people get up out of poverty, even though it has been aimed at middle class families. So think of what we could do if we would aim it down a little bit to actually help people do what they need to do. Uh, However, there's no compelling reason why these benefits could not also help individuals without children. That's just kind of something that probably would happen through the politics of it all. And some households that qualify for EITC fail to claim them and take advantage of the credit, which is kind of what I was alluding to, that there's a lot of people that aren't getting this money that absolutely deserve this money. If you're not lucky enough, like I am, to have a spouse that's actually quite good at doing your taxes, it usually is worth, the couple $100s, honestly, to go to a tax place to have them help you with that, because usually that's an investment on getting the money back that you actually need. Another thing we could try to do is to try to create more jobs. So economic policy should seek broad methods to stimulate job growth. We already do this, sort of, but we could do it better. This would include both passive and active employment measures. Well, what does that look like? Passive measures would be things like enhancing tax incentives for investment. So to basically encourage people through the tax code to invest in businesses. To enact consumer tax cuts. Notice these are kind of honestly conservative things that could help to creating jobs. So this isn't necessarily always a liberal kind of thing. Uh, Additionally, we could provide targeted wage subsidies to employers in order to stimulate job creation. What the heck is that? Well, an employer would receive a monthly subsidy for creating a position or hiring an individual from a population that would not otherwise be hired, right? If you are in an area where, say, certain minority groups are especially harmed, or people like those who have been in prison, no one wants to hire a ex-con. Uh, but you could put into effect subsidies that would encourage people to hire these ex-cons. And some of those programs already do exist, and some of them are very, very successful. There's a place in Columbus called Hot Chicken Takeover. I'm a big fan of them. And they have actually grown quite a bit over the last decade. Now, a neat thing about Hot Chicken Takeover is that when they first started, almost all of their employees were ex-cons. Actually, the owner explicitly hired people who had come out of prison, and he gave them job training. He gave them those skills, and he paid them a good wage to and basically create this very cool little local franchised out business. It should be noted that they do have some people working there that aren't currently that aren't ex-cons, but it is still overwhelmingly a minority-owned and operated business, and it, from all accounts, is very successful in terms of helping its employees. Something now those were passive measures. What do active measures look like, right? So passive measures are more along the lines of encouraging businesses to do things. These active employment measures would be if the government would actually actively create jobs. This would be traditionally, then, government jobs are very good paying and provide very good benefits. Now, that is operating in assuming that these government jobs would operate like other government jobs have, which would probably be, since a lot of people putting together these programs aren't super duper creative. Where would these jobs come from? Where would we do these jobs? We would build things. We would fix the roads that are broken. We could replace water systems in places where they really desperately need replaced. Places like Flint, Michigan, for example. We could build all kinds of things. We could build buildings for social workers in poor neighborhoods so that those social workers could help those neighborhoods. We could hire social workers to work in those buildings we just built, right? So this is a possibility. This is a real thing. Government can absolutely employ people in a very real way, and then once those people are employed, they pay taxes, and they help to basically pay for themselves, right? That's actually one of the things about economies, is that once they get big enough, things start paying for the system in and of itself. This has been done in the past to kind of defeat the Great Depression. We have Roosevelt's New Deal. There were organizations such as the Works Progress Administration and the Tennessee Valley Authority that created a lot of the infrastructure that we currently have today. Well, it's about 100 years later, and a lot of those old buildings have either fallen down or need repair direly, right? So if we would do this again, like we did in the 1930s, we could probably benefit our society pretty tremendously. It should be pointed out that some of these measures were put into place in the 2021 infrastructure bill, and that has done some in terms of stimulating our economy. It was not even close to the scale of the New Deal. Some more ambitious people have proposed what they call a Green New Deal. I don't think the idea of the Green New Deal is necessarily dead yet. It was proposed, but it was seen as, being too radical, however that is perceived. But the idea of the Green New Deal would be to transition us over from things like coal and oil over to those energy systems like solar and wind farms. And solar and wind are amazingly good ideas, but they do require a lot of work to put into place. So where do you get that work? How do you get that workers? How do you build it? The government employs people, could be one way to do it. Now let's talk a little bit more about universal basic income. What even is that idea? So the idea of a universal basic income sounds wild. Basically, we give everyone, probably when we say everyone, we mean adults age 18 and older, but it could hypothetically be applied to children. We give everyone some money every single month. That would be the idea. Basically saying, philosophically as a country, nobody should have to live a life in which they earn less than, say, $1,000 or maybe $2,000 every month. And if you really do the math of it, that's not even really enough to live, but it basically sets a base level of standard of living for everyone in the country, right? Now, it should be pointed out that that would be a big deal. That would be a huge change. And maybe it's hard for us to imagine what that would look like, but the fact of the matter is that before we do things, it's often hard to imagine what it would look like. When we put the Transcontinental Railroad into place in the mid 1800s, it felt impossible for that society that there could possibly be a way to get across the country in only, in quote, only a week, right? To travel like that in any way. Similarly, if you look at how people talked about the internet in the late 1990s, it is absolutely laughable to us in this decade. But they just didn't know what they were talking about. And if they had really, truly understood the full ramifications of the internet, maybe it would have never gone into place, or maybe it never would have happened. Additionally, things like same-sex marriage in 2013, I remember very distinctly. I was teaching sociology classes before that and then after that. And before the same-sex marriage ruling by the Supreme Court, people were always saying things, oh, I don't see how that would work. I don't see, like, there's no way that could possibly work in our society. But then, once the Supreme Court ruling went into place, once it was law of the land, I never saw those arguments ever again in my classes. It was really a stark, it was a weird thing. It was just a line in the sand. Very strange. Anyway. This idea of the universal basic income was actually proposed by Thomas Paine. Now, Thomas Paine is often pointed to as kind of a hero of very conservative economic theorists. The kind of people that would think that a universal basic income would absolutely be absolutely horrible. But the reality of the matter is that Paine proposed something that would work like this. Basically, one of Paine's big observations was that I'm taking that back. I don't know if I really should go into great detail. But if you do want to, if you're really curious about the more liberal economic theory of Paine, I would encourage you to look up the terms reclaiming the commons and then Thomas Paine. Basically, the short of it is that during Thomas Paine's lifetime, there were some really drastic measures taken in European societies that took a lot of resources away from poor people. And then what Paine was saying was that we need to repay poor people for those resources we took away from them. And one way to do that would be to give an amount of money either at least once in somebody's lifetime or at regular intervals. That was basically kind of the gist there. And I put like 400 pages worth of content into like a couple sentences. But that's the idea, that there were founding fathers that were talking about stuff like this. Additionally, oh, here's my bit about Paine, right? Sorry about that. So to make up for those resources that were taken away, certain amounts of money would be given. And for what Paine was proposing is that would be about $2,000 in today's money. And we talked about rights, we talked about privileges. Paine would propose that giving this amount of money would be an economic right. And this is not the same thing as a universal basic income, but it's philosophically the same general kind of thing. Similarly, there have been philosophers that have argued that black people, all descendants of slaves especially, should be given an amount of money to make up for the fact that their ancestors were prevented from building them an inheritance, right? That unfortunately never in a big way came to place in our society. There were some small scale doings of that, but it never really flourished in a way that it took off entirely. That's the same general kind of idea though. Child labor laws. When we're looking at things that we had a very hard time imagining, it is important to keep in mind that prior to the 1800s, it was very common for children to work in factories, mines, and other dangerous situations. Child labor was seen as important and critical to industry, and this isn't just a joke. They made arguments that we need kids because they have little hands to pull out of like machinery and stuff. Like they honestly were saying that. Sorry, I skipped ahead too fast and now it's not letting me go back. Just again, we're talking about universal basic income, and that sounds preposterous that we would just give everyone $2,000 a month. Well, these other things sounded preposterous too. The idea of the weekend is a modern idea. Prior to the late 1800s, everyone worked every single day, no matter what, unless they were rich enough to not work, basically. So we have the same thing we have today, where a lot of rich people don't work at all, while most working class, middle class, and poor people work tremendous amounts of money. The idea that every week there would be 2 days when most people don't work was a wild idea for those moments. However, in the late 1800s, both unions and churches, religious organizations, made the argument that there should be 2 days off at the end of the week, which is actually a very interesting example, social movement-wise, of how types of organizations that have common interests but aren't necessarily structured to do the same thing, such as unions and churches, can work toward a common goal. The churches wanted to make sure everyone would have Sunday off so that they could actually go to church, and that was the one that was first successful, right? Was the commonality of people getting Sundays off. And then over the next 40 years or so after the Sabbatarian movement, Saturday was added onto that because people were used to the idea of, the 1 day off, so maybe why not 2 days off? Now we could also make the argument then, well, what about 3 days off? What if we have guaranteed 3-day weekend. That would be the modern equivalent of making this, well, what if we had Sunday off, right? However, additionally, over the last 20 years, it has been more and more common for people to not necessarily get weekends, especially people in the food service industry. So that's an area where we've kind of backslid in that regard. The 8-hour workday is another one of those preposterous ideas. Um, Now, specifically stated as the 40-hour work week, right? We don't expect people to work 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. But prior to this movement, um, which again occurred in the late 1800s and was pushed forward by the unions of the time, uh, people were required to work 10 hours, maybe 12 or 14 hours every single day of their life, 7 days a week. So it was that combination of the 8-hour day and the weekend that basically created the basic practices of work in the United States to this day. And as I alluded to on the last slide, this has kind of fallen apart a bit in our service economy. So you could make a very easy argument that we need to take a look at a society. What would be the fair equivalent today? Would it be to guarantee all service workers at least 1, maybe 2 days that they cannot be scheduled per week in a way that would not lower their pay? That might be one way of doing it. So, and I know I got off on kind of some other things, and this lecture needs to be tweaked a little bit, but let's go back to the universal basic income for just a moment, right? After we got done talking about those things that seemed impossible for a while, what would it look like? Well, we could hypothetically send everyone a check every month. That would be kind of silly, quite frankly. Considering that we could just do direct deposit, right? Like how most of us get our paychecks, it just goes directly into our bank. So the government would give out this money either on a monthly or maybe, well, it could be either kind of bi-monthly, right? It could be twice a month, it could be once every 2 months, but basically it would operate just like a paycheck. And these paychecks would be given to everyone over the age of 18. Now, it could get more conservative or it could get more progressive, right? Maybe we would say this money only goes to people who have families with children. Or on the other end, we could also say we give it to absolutely everyone in society and we give more money to people who are raising children, right? To account for the amount of money coming to those children. Ooh, that's interesting. The most likely versions of this to pass, well, not to pass, that have been proposed by people in the United States who are not considered like radical and completely out there, has been saying $1,000 per month. Everyone is guaranteed $1,000 per month, $12,000 a year, which again, a lot of college students aren't necessarily, I didn't, for example, fully understand these kinds of finances until I was actually paying for all my own stuff. Some of you are probably already paying for your own stuff. But $12,000 a year is a very little amount of money. It's a very, very little amount of money. You could not live the life that you live today on $12,000 a year, probably. It would just be a minimum to keep people from starving and keep people from freezing to death, right? And we don't have that in our society now today. So if you want to look at those proposals, you could look at the what was put forward by a guy named Andrew Yang, who was a Democratic presidential candidate in, I believe, the 2020 election cycle. He didn't make it to really the finalists of the whole presidential contest. But Yang he's still active, and he had some really interesting ideas in this regard that I think have a very real chance of happening in the next 10 years. Additionally, then, it should be kept in mind that Richard Nixon, thought to be one of the absolutely most steel-fisted conservative people in modern history, he proposed this. He proposed that a universal basic income and giving everyone a certain amount of money, which, if you know anything about modern conservative politics, is not really something most of them would get on board with, especially people that consider themselves staunch Republicans or staunch conservatives. He was a man, Nixon, who would have been very suspicious of things that he considered to be socialism, right? Absolutely. And he thought it was socialistic. He probably wouldn't have been in support of it, right? So what's the point here about Richard Nixon, who's long dead? Well, what I'm showing you here is that it's possible for even the most conservative people to think that, yeah, maybe giving people a basic amount of money is a good idea. Additionally, there are countries that already do this. Finland and Switzerland. Finland and Switzerland already do this, and it should be pointed out that the vast majority of people do not just stop working. That's a common argument surrounding universal basic income is, well, if we just give people money, they'll just stop working and they'll just be lazy all the time. No, they won't be. The social science shows it pretty clearly, right? And of those people that did just stop working, they probably weren't very good employees in the first place, and they probably would have found an excuse to just stop working even without the universal basic income. Additionally, if we look at the 2020 pandemic stimulus checks that were put out, those checks that helped a lot of people, helped my family certainly, that was a short-term universal basic income program. That's exactly what it was. It helped everyone. Those who were in trouble, it absolutely helped more. And people didn't just stop working. Some people worked even harder because of it, to really incur, because they didn't have much else to do during the pandemic. Now, are these the only things that we could do? No, there's a bunch of things we could do. Regarding the universal basic income, we could send checks only to family with children. I alluded to this to a couple times. And this would at least address childhood poverty. So if in our society we could not get everyone on board to a universal basic income, we could at least send universal economic support to people who have kids. And this would make sure that kids aren't raised in poverty and that kids aren't the ones without health insurance. Kids aren't the one who don't have enough food to eat, right? In Europe, families with children under 18 already do receive this, regardless of financial circumstances. So I talked about Finland and Switzerland have that. Everyone has a universal basic income. Well, in those other places in Europe that don't have universal basic income, most places have this economic support for families with children. And is this somewhat problematic in terms of favoring nuclear families, just like the 1990 welfare reform was? Yeah, sure, it would be a little problematic, but it would be a lot better off for most families with kids. Okay, that is the end of this one. It's a little shorter. If you have any questions, just let me know.